does his wife to Salina, Ohio. He's posting pictures of his trip so far on Facebook, so you can enjoy following him there. I am so excited to have the opportunity to sub in for Rabbi Barris this afternoon. One, because I enjoy the show. I love seeing what you, our congregants, comment on the show. This is available via Facebook Live and TBAM streaming. The streaming does have a better connection, but if you have questions today, please type them in on Facebook Live. We have a lot this evening. We have Shabbat services. Tomorrow morning, of course, we have Torah study services and Havdalah. A lot going on in our congregation, but really today, the focus is on what is going on in the greater Miami community and really across the country and even across the world. Protests have erupted in Minneapolis, in Miami, and even in Jerusalem. All of these protests really talking about the way the structure of our society has been set up to value the life of Black people as less than that of a white individual. And really the way our criminal justice system is set up to support white supremacy in this way. So I realize I just said white supremacy. And of course, now you're all thinking about white supremacists, but you don't have to be somebody who wears a hood or somebody who is actively racist to be part of a white supremacist society. This just simply means we are part of a society that rewards whiteness as having more value than other colors. So this afternoon, we are going to spend an hour with an author that I greatly admire. When I was on maternity leave with my second son, Ezekiel, I picked up this book, just seeing that it was about Thurgood Marshall, called Devil in the Grove. And as I began to read the book, I was shocked to discover that it was about not just Thurgood Marshall, but about Florida and about the history of racism within our state, and as part of a larger conversation. So I'm very excited to have with us this afternoon a Pulitzer Prize winning author, Gilbert King. He is the author of 3 books, most recently Beneath a Ruthless Sun. This book that we're speaking about today, Devil in the Grove, and The Execution of Willie Francis. All 3 a combination of the justice system and the racism that we find within it through these different stories. The full title of the book we're discussing is Devil in the Grove, Thurgood Marshall, the Groveland Boys, and the Dawn of a New America. This won the Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction in 2013. It was a New York Times bestseller, and it was also named runner-up for the Dayton Literary Peace Prize for Nonfiction, and was a finalist for both the Chiquita Prize and the Edgar Award. So Gilbert King has written about race, civil rights, and the death penalty for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Atlantic. He's a contributor to the Marshall Project, a nonprofit news organization covering the U.S. criminal justice system. And he just is really admired. I admire him greatly. He's currently a fellow at the New York Public Library's Dorothy and Lewis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers. He lives in Brooklyn, New York, and he comes to us via a relationship through one of our members, Judge Scott Bernstein. And I'd love to invite Scott into our conversation briefly to talk about how he has used King's work.
Hi, everybody. I think you're really in for a treat today. I am very grateful that Mr. King has chosen to come in and speak to everybody. was in charge of judicial education for all the judges in the state of Florida, I put together a program on race and how it affects the justice system and inequities in the justice system. And I invited Mr. King to come in and speak about his book because I was so moved after I read the first one. I feel like a bit of a groupie having read all of his books, but I have to tell you, he's an incredible, and he's also a marvelous public speaker. And he tells stories about gross injustice in the legal system, and it's part of the system of white supremacy that has a long history in the state of Florida. And I really think everybody's going to be intrigued, and I'm just so grateful to him that he's willing to share with us today.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Scott. So to the Beth Am community, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Gilbert King to teach us now a little bit about our history and the story. If you have questions that are directed towards either Gilbert King or towards our judge, Scott Bernstein, or his husband, David Young, who is also a judge and can answer on it, may respond as well. All right, so I want to give you your full time. So Mr. Gilbert King.
Thank you very much, Rabbi. I just want to say thank you for doing this. Is the first talk I've done in several months. I'm usually out there on the road doing research and speaking. So this is a really great opportunity. And I haven't done one on PowerPoint yet, but over Zoom, but I have it already. It's going to be interesting. I do want to say, just one of the things I want to say is like this, doing it by Zoom is actually pretty nice because, a lot of times I go out and do this talk on the road and emotions are kind of raw. And I remember the very first time, my very first book talk, I went down to Florida in the heart of Lake County in Groveland to do the talk about Devil in the Grove. And it was right when it came out. And I remember walking towards this community center back in 2012. It was about 2 weeks after Trayvon Martin had been killed. And I'm returning to that same area of Central Florida. I knew that, nerves were pretty raw about this story that I was telling. And I started to get worse than butterflies. I was actually very anxious. And I was kind of hoping that maybe nobody showed up because I didn't really feel like I thought this out so well to return to this area. And then I saw all the cars outside this community building. And I said, oh, it looks like it's very crowded. And as I got closer to the building, a woman came running out and she said, Mr. King, thank you so much for coming, but I feel it's only fair to warn you that we've had 2 death threats called in about your talk this evening. And I remember thinking, this is like my very first talk, and now I'm absolutely terrified. And she said to me, but you have nothing to worry about. We called the Lake County Sheriff's Department, and they're going to send over some men. And I remember when they said that, I was like, did you read this book? It's all about the Lake County Sheriff's Department. So, but it turned out to be one of my greatest talks because it went on for hours. People who had lived through it really wanted to speak about this. And so even though I feel safer here doing this by Zoom, I really enjoy those moments to just sort of interact with the communities and listen to questions and have conversations. And so we're going to do that at the end of my talk today. But I want to start in right away with the presentation and just sort of take you through this. Let's do and share and then view slideshow. How's that look? Everybody see that? Okay. So I'm going to start out by doing some of these images that I think are really important because they give you a context of what was happening in the South in the 1940s and 50s and 60s. And one of the things that I always find kind of disturbing because I had done all the research on this book and I went back and I started to see these images. These are those iconic Jim Crow images that we see of the South that we think about when we think about segregation. The separate water fountains, white and colored, the separate entrances. African Americans were made to go into the Jim Crow balconies, and even some of the separate theaters. And I remember when I saw these images, which I've seen them all through my life, but while I was working on the research of this book, I remember seeing them again in a textbook. And my thought at the time was that these images do not do justice to American history. These images actually whitewash American history in a strange way. One of the things that these images, I think, do when we see the separate, water fountains, it sort of creates this narrative that the Jim Crow South was rude and impolite for African Americans, right? Those are two words that I think do not really begin to depict what I was finding in my research. What I was finding, I don't think was rude and impolite. I would use two different words: brutality and terrorism. And so when you put those images of the separate water fountains in a textbook and you teach people about what the Jim Crow South was like, I believe that those images truly whitewash the real history of brutality and terrorism that existed in this country. So I want you to sort of think about that as I go through this story of Devil in the Grove. And some people have pointed to this, said this is a very brutal look back at a time 70 years ago that almost seems like ancient history. And yet it's not ancient history. There are people alive from this story today. And so this is a living, breathing moment that we're living in. And it's been lingering since the end of slavery, into Reconstruction, into Jim Crow, well beyond the civil rights movements of the 60s, as you can see today. And so we'll talk about that as well. But I wanted you to have some kind of consciousness about these images and think about what those images and the story they tell in comparison to what I'm about to tell you. One of the things I like to start with in this particular case is a photograph from 1946. This is right, chapter 1. This is the story that takes place. And you'll see on the right, you can see Thurgood Marshall. He's standing there, he's sitting there. This is in Ohio. He's at the NAACP's annual convention, and he's about to accept the Spingarn Medal for the most important contribution by an African American that year. You can see him sitting next to the reigning heavyweight champion, Joe Louis, and the other man to the far left, Benjamin O. Davis, the commander of the Tuskegee Air Guard. Okay, so these are three African Americans in their prime, and they're here in Cincinnati, Ohio to celebrate Thurgood Marshall's award. He's the second youngest African American to receive this Spingarn Medal, and this is his big moment. And one of the things you notice in this image, I think, is that Thurgood Marshall is looking pretty slim in this photograph. If you've seen a lot of photographs of Marshall, he's kind of a portly, larger than life character. In this particular image, it's the only one I've really seen of him like this, he's looking very thin. And there's a reason for that. The reason is, as I start chapter 1 in this book, is that he went into a place in Tennessee where 24 African Americans were accused of attempted murder on police. Why? Because the Klan, mixed in with law enforcement, had come in to the downtown section of Columbia, Tennessee, and started shooting up indiscriminately Black homes and Black businesses. And many of the African Americans in that community had actually served in World War II. And there were a history of lynchings in this county. And so these African Americans fired back at the Klan and law enforcement. And by firing back, they got rounded up by the hundreds and had to stand trial for attempted murder of police. Thurgood Marshall went down to Tennessee and defended these 24 men, and against all odds, he got every one of them acquitted. It was even surprising to Thurgood Marshall that he'd won this case. They were very difficult to win in the South. And after the last man was acquitted, Marshall got into his car. They were going to drive back to Memphis, which was the closest place they could stay and be safe because there was African-American hotels. Got into the car with some of his fellow African-American lawyers and journalists. And as they were driving down, there was a roadblock set up by police. And Thurgood Marshall was dragged out of his car, thrown into a police car, and taken down to Duck River underneath a tree. And Marshall was terrified. He was sitting in the back, sandwiched between two deputies. And he said, I was absolutely about to be lynched. He could see a crowd of white men gathered behind underneath the tree along Duck River. And he thought this was the end. This was his moment, all of it for practicing law. Fortunately, the black men in that car made a U-turn and followed Marshall's car down to the river. And the white men thought that now there were now too many witnesses and it would be another racial incident. And so they ended up letting Marshall go. But Marshall and everybody else at that scene was absolutely convinced that Thurgood Marshall was about to be lynched. Think of that, a future Supreme Court justice, first African-American Supreme Court justice, and he's nearly lynched by the side of the river in 1946. And so that was the reason that Marshall was so thin. He was worn down, he was exhausted, he was under so much anxiety from this particular case. He lost about 50 pounds, he was running a fever. And so the day after this photograph was taken, Marshall got on a train, went back to New York, and he checked into a hospital for 3 months. Doctors did not know what was wrong with him. He had virus X. Fortunately, he survived, as we know. But that was the reason Marshall was looking so thin. It was because he was engaged in these tremendously violent and cases in the South at the time. One of the things, in order to get a little more context of what was happening in the 1940s, after World War II, you had more than 1 million African Americans returning home from service. They were willing to fight and die for their country. And when they came back, many of them returned to the Jim Crow South, where they were from. And what many people don't realize, in the summer of 1946, there was a wave of soldier lynchings across the South. African Americans being killed in their military uniform. Why was that? One of the things that they did was these African Americans who came back from, many of them serving in Europe, Germany, France, overseas, they felt that they had more freedoms and more respect overseas than they did in their own country. And so they felt that when they came back from service, they were forced back into this second-class citizenship of not equal rights. And so as a form of silent protest, many of these African-American veterans continued to wear their uniform as sort of a subtle reminder that, I was willing to fight and die for this country, and now we're being treated like second-class citizens. And that little form of provocation was, it was their undoing in many ways. Whites reacted to that as it was a very uppity thing to do, very provocative, to flaunt your military service and to remind people of the South that you were, somehow equal. That was no longer. You were now back in the South and you were a second-class citizen. And so by doing this silent protest, there was a wave of soldier lynchings across the South. And that was what Marshall and his lawyers from the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund were dealing with. And it was a very traumatizing thing because there's not very much that Marshall can do. They cannot force prosecution, right? And so they would really just encourage the communities to get involved in these cases, encourage prosecutors to go out and find these lynchers. And the shocking thing is none of these cases were ever solved. They were solved technically, but they were not solved legally. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So in that horrible, terrible summer of 1946, which what Thurgood Marshall called it, the Legal Defense Fund attorneys spent much of their time in that summer going around to funerals like this one, a military funeral. These are for Black servicemen who were lynched in the South, returning from World War II. The face of that terrible summer of 1946 was a man by the name of Isaac Woodard, who was returning from his service. He got on a Greyhound bus and was returning back to New York from North Carolina. And at one point, he was dragged off the bus by law enforcement and beaten so severely that he had lost his vision in his eyes. He was unconscious, lost his memory. Slowly, he began to regain this. And in the summer of 1946, Orson Welles had a radio show, and he would talk about the blinding of Isaac Woodard. Woody Guthrie, the folk singer, had written a song called The Blinding of Isaac Woodard. And together they sort of raised awareness about what was happening to African-American servicemen upon their return to the United States. And Isaac Woodard, you can see again here with Joe Louis, he's taken around the country. He's doing these speaking engagements. And this was all a part of trying to educate the public about some of these atrocities and some of this brutality that was happening to African Americans that was not really making the mainstream media. This was largely covered in leftist publications and African American newspapers. These kind of stories were not really crossing into the mainstream until that summer of 1946, when people like Orson Welles started to talk about it. And so that was sort of the environment that Thurgood Marshall was dealing with in the late 1940s following World War II. Many times he would just get on a train by himself and go down and start these cases. That was a very early part of what would become Brown versus Board. There were several legal cases around the country, school segregation cases. Marshall was doing these, but he also felt that he needed to be involved in these cases, usually death penalty cases, where he believed African Americans were being wrongly accused of a capital case, of a capital charge. And normally, because of the hysteria, those usually involved sexual accusations involving white women. And this was a very popular thing that would happen. Sometimes you'd see a mass exodus of Black lives leaving these towns because of the violence that would follow these explosive accusations. And Marshall, some of his own colleagues would say, Thurgood, why are you doing this? Why are you going down south and taking these death penalty cases? You are irreplaceable to the civil rights movement. We need you taking these cases that can improve the lives of millions, the school cases, the voting cases, the housing cases. You can't just keep going down and taking these violent cases where the Klan is out to get you. And Marshall was very adamant. I think he was really on the forefront of what we now call the Black Lives Matter movement. Marshall said, these cases matter. These cases save lives. And he knew that he was often the last resort. He was the last line separating an African American from going to the electric chair. He could step in with his lawyers and take it to a higher court, the appellate court, maybe even the US Supreme Court. And Marshall knew that was really the only way to get justice, was to bring these cases to a higher court that he felt was an equal and more level playing field, which is what he thought of the US Supreme Court. And so that was his goal in these cases, was he knew he was going to lose these cases locally, but he wanted to appeal them to a higher court and possibly save lives that way. This is an image that I like to show. I've cropped it a little bit. It's a very disturbing image. So I've cropped it in a little bit to focus on what I think is really important. Thurgood Marshall, in his day as the head of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, he saw hundreds of lynching photographs over his career. This was the one that he said haunted him in his dreams. This is a man named Reuben Stacy, who was lynched a few dozen miles up the road outside of Fort Lauderdale. And this man's name was Reuben Stacy, and it was another one of those wild accusations about possibly having sexually assaulted somebody. Turned out not to be true, but they dragged him over to a Florida pine tree and lynched him. And again, I've cropped this. You don't really see the bulging eyes, the neck cutting it with rope, or even the bullet holes. What you see in this image is the image that really haunted Thurgood Marshall. He used to say that he would wake up in a cold sweat thinking of this image. And he said it wasn't all the violence in the image that haunted him. It was the faces of these young children who were brought out in their Sunday best to pose alongside the dangling corpse of an African American. And Marshall said that's what haunted him, that someday his time would come and all the children would be brought out in their Sunday best and celebrate over his body. And so this was the one image that really struck me. And, I was giving a talk in Tampa a couple of years ago, and this woman came up to me, African-American middle-aged woman, and she said to me, I just wanted to tell you how much I really was disturbed by, but I really enjoyed your book. One of my relatives was in your book. And I said, oh, which one was that? And she's thought about it a moment. She said, Reuben Stacy, the man who was lynched. And I said, oh, I plan on doing a talk about that, and I was going to show a slide. And, out of respect, if you're here with your family, I'm happy to remove that slide from my presentation. And she thought about it for a moment, and then she said, no, talk about it. I want people to know about that. And then she went on to tell me this story that was a story that lingered in her family. And she was very aware of Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP. And she said, Thurgood Marshall changed my life. I was inspired by his work that I went on to go to Howard University Law School, Thurgood's alma mater, and that she went on to become the first elected female African-American judge in Hillsborough County. And her name is the Honorable Lisa Campbell. And I always thought about that because it's sort of reminded me of that connection to Florida and the stories I hear. And, here's a woman who this unspeakable tragedy happens in her family long before she was born, but she was aware of it. And she was aware of what might be possible because of the example of Thurgood Marshall. And so I thought it was like, if there was ever sort of an upside to a lynching photograph, that example would be the Honorable Lisa Campbell. I was always very moved by that. I like to show this image because this is the image of Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers at the LDF in the late 1940s. And here you can see 5 people. I like to think of these 5 as the best and the brightest. In this image, you see 2 women. That's not a mistake. These are not the paralegals or the secretaries. Thurgood Marshall actually hired women as lawyers at a time where really a lot of firms in New York and Washington were not hiring women as attorneys, maybe administrative staff or paralegals. But 40% of Marshall's dream team were made up of women. You see that Constance Baker Motley became a federal judge. In this image, you see 2 federal judges, an ambassador, an executive with the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, and a Supreme Court justice. So this really was the best and the brightest. If you had a case involving 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment law, there's no lawyers you would rather have than this particular team from the Legal Defense Fund. They were wildly successful, won, I think, 28 of the 32 cases that Marshall argued. He shouldn't have lost those other 3. I looked into those. I was very curious about them. And so this was really the best and the brightest. And this was often the last resort when African Americans were wrongly accused. So now that you have a little bit of background of the context of what was happening, I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of the crime story and just sort of remind you what a typical incident this was. And this incident begins in July of 1949. This is Norma Pageant and her husband, Willie. Norma is 17 years old. She's been married for about 6 months, but there's rumors going around town that Willie is an abusive spouse. And because he'd been beating her, they decided to separate the family, separate this couple. And so for 6 months, they were separated. And then the families decide, well, maybe they can give it another try. So they went out to a dance in July of 49, picked up a bottle of whiskey and went to a club. And we don't really know what quite happened yet next, but we know they were heading home from that club about 1 a.m. And their car broke down on the side of the road. And the next thing we know, that Norma Pageant has made an accusation that she has been abducted and sexually assaulted by 4 African Americans. Within hours of those charges, the Ku Klux Klan rolls into Groveland in Lake County, Florida, and begins to burn down Black homes. And you can see Sheriff Willis McCall in the center with the white Stetson. He's surveying the damage. To the left, you can see Jesse Hunter, the prosecutor. To the right, one of the deputies, James Yates, and they're surveying the damage from the night before. Life magazine has sent a photographer. They're looking at the ashy ruins of this house. What you don't really realize is that the sheriff, Willis McCall in the center here, was actually the ringleader of the Klan the night before. He was the one that was sort of the field general, reminding the Klan which houses to burn down. So that was a way that law enforcement sort of worked in tandem with the Ku Klux Klan. And that was very obvious in this particular case, that Willis McCall had to say there was not going to be this kind of violence in his county without his approval. And so he was there guiding these forces that night. And here you can see an image of, they would be called the Groveland Boys. Here's 3 of them after their arrest. The interesting thing about this, and you can see Willis McCall to the left sort of bringing these men out. These are 3 of the men who are about to be charged with the rape of Norma Pageant. And what's interesting about this photograph, it was taken 3 weeks after the alleged incident. And the reason for that was law enforcement beat these 3 men so severely that they needed some time to go by for their wounds to heal. They had teeth knocked out, welts all over their body, bloodied, beaten with hoses in the basement. Their feet were bloody from throwing broken Coke bottles on the ground, so that these men would have to walk on that. The FBI took photographs. These men were beaten severely. Willis McCall, right before this photo op, got them all a fresh change of clothes and paraded them out there, saying that these 3 men have confessed to the rape of Norma Pageant, which really was not true. The violence got so bad in Lake County that the National Guard was called in. Troops were sent to the streets with machine guns, and they really were trying to prevent a mass exodus of labor. They were trying to quiet this down. And this was done by the wealthier white people in this community because they had seen the effects of Rosewood, Ocoee, other towns in Florida that had seen mass exoduses. And the wealthier white people who owned the orange groves took a tremendous economic beating when there was an exodus. So they were actually in the weird place, not because they were necessarily racially enlightened, but they were protecting their pocketbooks. And so they wanted to make sure that the National Guard would just quiet things down so that they did not lose all the black labor that they were dependent on in the fields. And here's another image of the 3 Groveland Boys. You'll notice that in the media accounts, they were called the Groveland Four. Well, one of the things that happened in this particular case was one of the alleged suspects saw what was happening in Groveland with the burning down of black homes. He knew it was in store for him. He got out of town his first opportunity. Sheriff Willis McCall put together a posse of more than 1,000 men. They hunted the 4th Groveland boy down in a swamp, and he was found later riddled with bullets. There was absolutely no chance that Ernest Thomas was going to be taken back alive to stand trial. And so that's how we are now down to the 3 Groveland boys. You can see the way the media covered this in the 1940s and early 50s. Already they're looking for the supreme penalty, 4 electric chairs out in the newspaper. This is days after the alleged event. I mean, you can see at the very bottom, there's a message there. And that message is designed to come from Sheriff Willis McCall to Thurgood Marshall. And he basically says, if outsiders seek to hamper justice by coming down here to represent these African Americans, you're making a big mistake. This is going to be much worse for the races. Let us just put these African Americans through the process, through public defenders, and then we'll send them to the electric chair after a fair trial. That was the message that Sheriff Willis McCall was trying to send. Fortunately, Thurgood Marshall had been through this. He was not going to accept Willis McCall's legal advice. One of the things I kept waiting for while I was reading this and doing the research was this sort of To Kill a Mockingbird type moment in the trial. I thought that was the way it was going to play out. And so I started reading the transcripts. Maybe there's a moment where Thurgood Marshall gets up in court and cross-examines Norma Pageant and gets to the very truth of the matter, the same way that Gregory Peck as Atticus Finch questioned Mayella Ewell. The sad truth is that could never happen in the Jim Crow South. Thurgood Marshall was warned, there's no way that you, as a black man, can get up in court and question the word of a white woman in front of 12 white male jurors and a judge. That will never happen. That's the quickest way to send your clients to the electric chair. That will be so offensive to the jury. So what the strategy that they end up doing is saying, we're not questioning whether you were sexually assaulted or not. We're just saying you misidentified the suspects. And if you look at the way she was handled, they actually had to hire a white lawyer by the name of Alex Ackerman to come in for the sole purpose to question the white witnesses, because they were so afraid how jurors would react if they saw a black man questioning the word of a white person. So that was how bizarre it was to see African Americans inside a courtroom who were not defendants. That was one of the major issues of this trial. And so when you look back at through that lens, it kind of appears pretty lame as far as defenses go. The Groveland Boys were pinned into this weird defense that, probably couldn't help them very much. I like to show this photograph because, and this is another one of those Life magazine photographs. They sent a photographer down the very next day after the burning of the houses to cover this. And unfortunately, this story was killed. Life magazine never published any of these photographs, but I found them in what they call the dead file. And it was basically a real-time exploration of this case. The photographer followed Sheriff Willis McCall around as he investigated this case. And one of the interesting things about this photograph is all about white supremacy. If you know what's happening in this photograph, you will see the power of white supremacy, and it doesn't quite look like what you might expect. On the left here, you can see a young man by the name of Lawrence Bertoft, and he was the first person to encounter Norma Pageant after her accusations. And in the foreground, you can see the prosecutor, Jesse Hunter, and he's questioning Lawrence Bertoft. And if you read the transcripts, what he's saying is, Lawrence, don't you remember? You woke up early that morning. You saw a young girl with a ripped dress standing outside your cafe, and she was screaming, help, help, I've been raped, help me. And Lawrence Bertoft had a conversation with his mother. And he said, Mother, they're trying to put words in my mouth. They're trying to get me to say things that did not happen to fit their narrative. And Lawrence's mother said, son, just tell the truth. If they take away Dad's store and cafe, that's fine, but just tell the truth. And so Bertoft stands up and says, that's not at all what happened. I told you, she came into the store. We had a 15-minute conversation. All she said was she was looking for her husband. She didn't say anything about being sexually assaulted. She didn't convey that to me at all. And the prosecutor's trying to get him to change that narrative. And you can see the murderous sheriff, Willis McCall, and his deputy just glaring at this kid because they are used to getting their way with witnesses and shaping this narrative. And if you look at the transcript, all the other witnesses have lied, perjured themselves in order to go along with the narrative that is rooted in white supremacy. And so that's what you're seeing there in this case. This is the power of white supremacy bearing down on a white person to maintain that structure of white supremacy. Because Lawrence Bertoft refused to go along with the story, he was hidden as a witness from the defense. So Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers were unaware of this witness and the fact that he could possibly be provide exculpatory evidence. I won't go into the trial too much. I'll just tell you that, to no surprise, the Groveland Boys were convicted and sentenced to death. Two of them, the third, Charles Greenlee, 16 years old, because he had an alibi, the judge and jury gave mercy to him. So he was given life on a chain gang. And Thurgood Marshall said, that's how you know the jury thought your man was innocent. They only gave him life. That was the way that Marshall viewed the justice system in the South. He was really just trying to get it to the next level, the appeal. So I'm going to fast forward to about a year and a half later. This is a picture of Thurgood Marshall and his lawyers arguing this case before the U.S. Supreme Court. What I love about this picture is that they look pretty loose. They're all smiling. This was taken before the arguments. Marshall had been down this route many times. He knew that he wasn't going to win in a small antebellum courtroom in the Jim Crow South. But once he got it before the great legal minds of the U.S. Supreme Court, that was where he felt he had his best chances. And so he knew the law, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, better than anybody. They knew they were going to emerge victorious because of prior decisions in the Supreme Court. Florida sent their attorney general up there to argue the case, and he was basically humiliated in that courthouse because They were trying to justify some of the things they'd done in terms of change of venue, witnesses, the confessions, the way the grand jury selection. They had a lot to choose from. Ultimately, this case was reversed by the US Supreme Court. The verdict was thrown out. Justice Robert Jackson wrote the opinion, and he basically wrote a very strong opinion. He alluded to the issues that were brought up in the appeal, the change of venue and the way the grand jury was selected, but he went one step further. He said, this case presents one of the best examples of one of the worst menaces to American justice. On those grounds, I overturn. In other words, he was saying that this case was an injustice at every single level. And forget about those smaller issues of grand jury. This is an abomination, and he wanted it thrown out. Well, you can imagine what the reaction was back in Lake County, right? Especially Sheriff Willis McCall. Now, McCall, if you read the book, you'll see the story. He starts out as kind of a hero. There's about to be a lynching when they find out that the 3 Groveland boys are up in that jail. The Klan comes to that jail, and they're going to lynch them. And Marshall, or I should say, Willis McCall becomes a hero. He says, there's not going to be a lynching in my county. We're going to give these boys a fair trial, then we're going to send them to the electric chair. That was his implicit bargain with the people of Lake County. So when all of a sudden the Supreme Court comes in and overturns this Lake County verdict, well, Willis McCall is furious. And he says, I have an idea. The Supreme Court's going to order a retrial. I'll drive up to Rayford State Prison, pick up the Groveland boys, and bring them back down for retrial. And so that's what he does. He takes Walter Irvin and Sam Shepard, and he handcuffs them, throws them in the car, and starts driving back to the Lake County Courthouse because there's going to be a new trial the next morning. Except on his way back to that courthouse, in the dark of night, Willis McCall makes a detour down a dirt road in his home county of Lake County. And the next thing you know, 2 of the Groveland boys, Walter Irvin and Sam Shepard, are laying in a ditch riddled with bullets outside Willis McCall's car. This photograph, I think, is one of the classic photographs. Everything you see in this image is a lie. You can see his trademark rumpled Stetson sitting on the hood of the car there. You can see his clothes, or he's disheveled. He's got a little bit of blood trickling out, and he's walking around this crime scene when the witnesses start to come back saying, it was a terrible thing. We almost got to the courthouse. They went for my gun. They were going to try and escape, and I had no choice. I got out of the car and I had to shoot them. They were coming at me, and it was either them or me, and I had to defend myself. And this is the story he's telling. And one of the photographers sets up a camera and shoots, and as the flash fires, one of the witnesses says, wait a second, one of those boys just moved. He's not dead. And sure enough, Walter Irvin, the young man on the right, was actually still breathing. He was handcuffed to his best friend, Sam Shepard, who was killed instantly. And so what do they do at this point? They call for an ambulance. The ambulance comes and takes Sheriff Willis McCall, and because of the extent of his injuries, they put him in the ambulance and send him to the hospital in Leesburg. They have to wait another 45 minutes because there's no ambulances in Lake County that will transport African Americans. So they call a hearse from a black funeral home to pick up Sam Shepard, bring him to the morgue, and Walter Irvin, who's still alive, finally makes it to the hospital. And as they're in the hospital that night, Walter Irvin begins to regain consciousness. And there's rumors floating around the hospital that he's beginning to tell a story that's slightly different from the one that Willis McCall is saying about an attack. Walter Irvin is telling a story of cold-blooded murder. And you can see him in the hospital here. There's Thurgood Marshall in the foreground. He's talking to Walter Irvin, finding out what happened. There's stenographers there, the press is there, doctors, the FBI is there, and they're listening. And Irvin says basically the same story, that he was handcuffed to Sam Shepard, thrown in the car. And then he said the sheriff claimed that he was getting a flat tire, and he pulled the car over, and unprovoked, he just opened fire on Sam Shepard, 3 shots, 2 to his chest and 1 to his head, killed Sam Shepard instantly. Walter Irvin is handcuffed to Shepard. There's nowhere he can run. McCall shoots him once in the chest and once in the ribs, and he pretends to be dead. He lays down on the side. He can't run anywhere, so all he can do is hold his breath, close his eyes, and pretend to be dead. And then he says he hears Willis McCall get on the radio to call back to his deputy, James Yates. And he says, get back here, get back here. I got him good. I got him good. And so Walter Irvin is just laying there in terror. And then he hears another car come up. He can feel the headlights, and he hears the footsteps, and he's got his eyes closed. And then he feels a flashlight shining over his eyes. And he hears the deputy say, this one ain't dead yet. And he opens his eyes, and Walter Irvin is staring down the barrel of a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson. And then there's a gunfire flash. Remarkably, Walter Irvin is shot right through the neck, and he's still alive. And he continues to pretend to be dead. And at that point, he says, Irvin is laying there. He says that the sheriff and the deputy say, we got to make it look like an escape. And they continued to tell this story, pull my hair out and put it in one of the victim's hair, rip my clothes. And they set up the story, and then they call witnesses back to the scene. Well, the FBI is in that hospital room listening to that. And they've already gotten a statement from Sheriff Willis McCall, who basically has said, they were attacking me. I emptied my barrel. Well, they know that they found 5 bullets, 3 in Sam Shepard and 2 in Walter Irvin. If that 6th bullet, the one that went straight through Irvin's neck, is never going to be found if Sheriff Willis McCall is telling the truth, because he was advancing on the sheriff and it went straight through his neck. But the FBI thinks if Irvin's telling the truth, we have an idea where that 6th bullet might be. And so they rush back to the crime scene from the night before, and they find the blood spot where Walter Irvin was laying the night before. And they take out a little shovel and they begin to dig. And then they find 10 inches below the surface, a .38 caliber bullet. This bullet would later match the same gun that Deputy James Yates was carrying that night. So now the FBI is convinced that this is murder and attempted murder. This is no escape attempt. And they write a very strong report urging the U.S. attorney to prosecute both the sheriff and his deputy for murder. Probably the most disturbing part of this entire story was that this FBI report was buried. I filed the Freedom of Information Act in 2010, and I was the first one to open up these envelopes with the bullet, all the reports of the FBI. Thurgood Marshall, his lawyers knew nothing of this. This was all buried, and the FBI was livid. They thought that this was one of the most strongest cases they had ever seen in terms of having forensic evidence and a living witness to describe this police brutality. This, to them, they didn't know it at the time, was the equivalent basically of having a cell phone with coverage, the kind of coverage that we're seeing today. This was the strongest case of having forensic evidence and a living witness. And remarkably, this entire case was quashed. The judge in this particular case said that the coroner's jury was so thorough. Coroner's jury, by the way, was selected by the sheriff, his friends, and they ruled that this was self-defense. And so this entire investigation was quashed and hidden within the files. And one of the FBI agents said something that really resonated with me. He was furious that there was not going to be charges on this. And he wrote a report saying he was told it was being quashed for 4 words. Those 4 words, tranquility of the South. In other words, if people really understood the depravity of what was happening in this country, they might riot in the streets. And so the FBI decided to hide all this evidence, and nobody, not even Thurgood Marshall's men, saw it. This gets the attention of a journalist, a female journalist who begins to write about this story. She's taken the side of the sheriff, and she starts reporting on it. One of the people who is also working with Thurgood Marshall in this particular case, let me go back, is a man by the name of Harry T. Moore. Not a lawyer. He was the president of the Florida NAACP, the executive secretary. And he lives in Florida. He's calling attention to Willis McCall. That's the job he's tasked with. And so he goes down to Overton into Miami. Thurgood Marshall makes a really stirring speech at the Mount Zion Baptist Church right in Overtown. And Harry T. Moore is so inspired by this that he drives back to Central Florida, determined that he's going to put more pressure on Willis McCall. That decision ultimately would cost him his life. When he started agitating for this, the Klan put a bomb underneath his house, killing both Harry T. Moore and his wife, Harriet, on Christmas night, 1951, in the middle of these trials. This is the most senior person in the civil rights movement to be killed. Really the first martyr of the modern day civil rights movement. And nobody really knows his name, Harry T. Moore. In fact, there's a monument to civil rights martyrs in Alabama, and Harry T. Moore's name is not even on it. It's because this happened so early in that pre-civil rights movement. Also, I think one of the reasons it happened this way is that Florida was not seen as part of the Jim Crow South. It was considered, I write about this in the book, south of the South, sort of a progressive state. It had Miami, very, had an immigration. It just Florida didn't seem like the typical Cotton Belt South. And you had a fairly progressive governor, Leroy Collins. So people didn't look at things that were happening in Florida as part of a civil rights movement. And so a lot of these stories, we've all heard of the Scottsboro Boys. Well, this is the Groveland Boys. This is a much more violent and dramatic case. It involved Thurgood Marshall, and really nobody's heard of this case. And I really do believe it was because Florida kind of flew under the radar in the Jim Crow South. I like to show this image. There was a second trial, only one defendant, Walter Irvin. And you can see in the middle, there's a white gentleman by the name of Jack Greenberg. And I like to show this image because, this trial was 1951. Greenberg only died 2 years ago. I talked to him about this, interviewed him. He said, I was never more terrified in my life about going down to Central Florida and taking this case. He said that, he'd stormed the beaches of Iwo Jima during World War II. This was more terrifying. And he said, I feel like a coward because I'm a white man and I can leave here anytime I want. I cannot imagine what it's like for African Americans devoted to the cause of civil rights to have to live down here. And when he was talking about Harry T. Moore and his wife, that kind of terror. A lot of people don't realize that Marshall traveled around the country speaking about this Groveland case. One of the things that he found was that you can put voting rights violations and school segregation in the newspapers. It doesn't really attract as much attention. When you start putting bodies and telling stories of lost lives, that resonates. More than $100,000 flowed into the offices of the NAACP for this case. And because it was almost already over, Marshall was able to roll all that money into Brown versus Board, which is one of the most impressive cases ever put together in terms of civil rights. One of the most beautiful civil rights documents. And it was because Marshall had the resources to do the kind of work on Brown versus Board. And it was from this Groveland case in Florida that they built up their coffers and were able to do this. And there you see a picture of Thurgood Marshall, Mr. Civil Rights, in his glory. One of the things that Marshall was famous for doing was winning these important cases before the Supreme Court. But in this particular case, it wasn't just what Marshall was doing in the courtroom. It was the way he carried himself. One of the things that Marshall said is like, I know I'm going to lose these cases in the South, but look up into those Jim Crow balconies. There are hundreds of people who have come from miles and miles around to see me argue this case, to see me stand there in a suit arguing law with powerful white people. And Marshall said, I'm giving them a glimpse into hope, into what the future could look like. and said, Marshall said, that's just as important as taking these cases, is to give communities hopes about what may be possible. And Marshall's impact in this case was so far reaching, and you can read about this, that he took this 77-year-old, admittedly racist prosecutor and had such an impact on him that this prosecutor ended up writing a letter to the governor later on saying, I don't believe we had this case right. And he questioned the guilt of the very people that he prosecuted. And he attributed that to the impact that Thurgood Marshall had on him in court. And as he was getting older and dying, he decided to clear his conscience. And that plays a very big role in this case, reaching outside the courtrooms. What can we do? Getting all these religious communities, every denomination, to write letters to the governor, to agitate, to speak out about this, to form an orange juice boycott, a tourism boycott, all of these things outside the case that really plays a big part in this. And I won't give away the ending if you haven't read it yet, but I will get a cross forward to the impact of this. I think 7 years after this book came out, caught a lot of attention, especially in Florida. And some people in Florida decided to take up this movement. The families got together, some politicians, religious communities, and got together and say, we need to address this gross injustice. And so 2.5 years ago, the state of Florida apologized for the gross injustice and promised to investigate. And you'll see this is a photograph from last year. I showed you the picture of Jack Greenberg, the young lawyer who was terrified to go down and take this case. When I talk about people who are still alive, Norma Pageant, the alleged victim in this particular case, 70 years later, decided to come forward when the state of Florida was considering pardoning the Groveland Boys. And she showed up with her sons, and she basically had not talked to anybody in 70 years. And she decided to use this moment to break her silence. And she said she stuck to her original story, that she was sexually assaulted. And it was a very powerful moment because it was before the Florida Clemency Board. So the new governor, Ron DeSantis, was in there, Attorney General, Agriculture, CFO of the state. All 4 members of the Clemency Board were sitting there. And I remember at one point they asked me to go up and talk about the history of this case. And I remember my thoughts very clearly. It was like, this is not about Norma Pageant and a he said, she said thing. This case should not hinge on the words of people. 70 years ago, Norma Pageant stood up in that courtroom and pointed out the Groveland Boys, and the trial did not need to go any further. That was such an explosive charge at the time that the jury had made up their mind. What the Clemency Board was now saying was that now we have all this evidence, this hidden evidence that was hidden from the defense, showing perjury, showing murder, attempted murder, and basically got into the case with documents that had not been seen at the time. And so when I got up to testify, I really wanted the Clemency Board to understand that this is about what happened to those young African Americans in that courtroom. That was where the tragedy of justice. And I do believe that angle enabled Governor DeSantis and the rest of his Clemency Board to hold a vote, which they did right then. And they decided to pardon the Groveland Boys, all 4 of them, even Ernest Thomas, who was killed before the trial. That they got posthumous pardons from the state of Florida. And the next process is going to be exonerations. And so I'm working with the Attorney General's office to provide all my files so that these young men will be exonerated. And so that's pretty much the story of the Groveland case involving Thurgood Marshall and justice. And I think one of the things you can think about when you look at this particular case from 70 years ago, your first instinct is like, well, that was ancient history. Well, I think if you've lived in the past 2 weeks, you know that this is not ancient history. And the reason is we have never really come to terms with the end of slavery and what has happened in this country. You know, a lot of people, the narrative that we like to think is like, well, yes, we had the original sin, slavery, but then, you know, Abe Lincoln came along and freed the slaves, and, you know, 100 years passed and we had some civil rights problems, and Martin Luther King came along. And so that's kind of the narrative that we like to attach to this heroic these figures who actually did make tremendous changes. But between Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War and when Martin Luther King came along in the late 50s and early 60s, there was about 100 years where it was pretty awful, and we did not talk about that. We prefer to talk about the separate water fountains. Because if we talk about the loss of life and the state-sponsored lynchings, it's very uncomfortable. And we don't want to poison children's minds by having them take on this kind of terror and racism, because it doesn't fit the narrative that we like to tell about this great country. So when you look back at, Germany after the Holocaust, they destroyed all the relics of Nazi Germany. You can't go anywhere in Berlin or any other city without seeing reminders of the past, the stumbling stones commemorating the victims of the Holocaust, plaques, monuments, artistic displays. It's all a part of German culture now, and they embrace it. The same way at the end of apartheid, you had racial conciliation commissions that were designed to give immunity to people to testify to the truth so that the truth can never be denied. And so that is what we don't have in this country. We don't have a program of some kind of reconciliation. So these events pop up and then they get swept right back under the rug. I like to think I'm a little bit hopeful this time. This one feels a little bit different. It feels like there could be changes coming. It definitely feels different than the Trayvon Martin case and some of the other cases that I've lived through and experienced in the writing of these books. So we really might be at the precipice of real change and real addressing of these issues. I honestly think that we have the nation's attention, and what happens now is really up to us. And so I just wanted to end on that note of positiveness. I also think the state of Florida, for recognizing this injustice, puts it past many other states who have just chosen to ignore this. Give credit to the state of Florida. It was done in a bipartisan fashion. They came together unanimously in both the House and the Senate to pardon the Groveland Boys and address this, because you cannot have credibility in the court system unless you address the injustices of the past. So I will leave it at that. I'm happy to take questions. Hope I've left enough time.
Yes, thank you. You didn't actually, but it is such a powerful story, and I think so. I want to thank you so much for your time and for this presentation. And I really think there's so much that that you touched upon. I'm gonna invite. I know a lot of people have to tune out at 1 o'clock. I'm gonna go maybe just 5 minutes over just to be able to address some of the questions that were asked. One of our viewers said that this really reminded them of the Central Park Five, and they were curious about the ages of these accused boys.
The ages were, the youngest was 16 and the oldest was 23.
Wow.
Two of them didn't even know each other. I mean, what the real tragedy of this is, they concocted this story that there had to be 4 African Americans. Well, they arrested 2, and they had to reach into the other parts of the community to get 2 more, because Norma allegedly said it was 4 attackers. And so it was basically, you'll see in the book, it's housekeeping. The sheriff knew which 4 he wanted to target. Potential troublemakers. 2 of them had continued to wear their military uniforms. That was seen as provocative, and so they were targeted. Walter Irvin and Sam Shepard, the ones who were shot by the sheriff. 16-year-old Charles Greenlee was there picking oranges. He got arrested that evening for vagrancy. He was waiting for his workday to start, and he was actually in a small jail, sleeping overnight, guarded by police, and they were able to successfully put him at the scene of that alleged sexual assault. So he had nothing to do with it. He just gets into town that day, but it's very similar to the Central Park Five.
Thank you. Yeah, it's kind of surprising how similar. So I want to thank you again, Gilbert King, Pulitzer Prize-winning author. I encourage all of the people who have been watching to really pick up your book. We can't learn about where we are now without learning about our history. And as Mr. King has taught us today, We do like to think that there was slavery and then nothing. But really, there was a period of terrorism, domestic terrorism against Black communities. And your book really reiterates how intertwined the Klan, white supremacy, the court system, and the police departments were. So our entire justice system built on this idea of white supremacy and how disposable Black lives were. That image that you shared with us that Thurgood Marshall said he had nightmares about, that this was a form of entertainment. You see that little girl smiling and she can't possibly think this is a real human being that she is looking at. And it really just has so many echoes of what is happening now. And I wanted to end really with with what you taught us about soldier lynchings, because it was something that I didn't know about. And it really reminded me of that quintessential image of the protester in the Ferguson riots, like who picked up the tear gas and threw it back at the police, who was wearing an American flag shirt. And what does it mean to be a patriot? And a patriot is not someone who simply upholds the systems as they are, but a patriot is someone who loves our country enough to believe that we can do better and we can be an example to the world. As Jewish people, we take this as our role to be a light unto the nations, and we want our nation to be a light. So again, thank you so much, Gilbert King, for being with us. And thank you everybody for watching.
Thank you very much.